I'm going to be teaching a class of 8th grade students how to revise their papers on the scientific method. Now, I believe the scientific method is a topic that should be taught and retaught to students all throughout middle school and high school. That being said, especially as 8th graders preparing to go into high school, it's so important to take the time to really go through the steps of the method and make sure that students have a solid understanding of them. So I really liked this assignment. The writing assignment was that the students were to write an essay on the steps of the scientific method, also including why the scientific method is so important. Now, when I was reading this sample, I found that the student and the class in general had some misconceptions about what was actually going on in each of the steps. The order of the steps was also an issue, and there were some steps that were actually missing altogether, as well as some grammatical issues that needed to be addressed. So for this lesson, I wanted to do a ratiocination of the grammatical errors, the common grammatical errors that I saw within the class papers, and I also wanted to model a cut and grow revision strategy and then send the students off to do that cut and grow strategy on their own independently. But first, I wanted to go through the steps of the scientific method. Now, the students were likely already taught the steps before they were assigned this paper, but based off of what I saw in the papers, they definitely needed a review. So, on the board, to start off the lesson, I would go through a review of the steps of the scientific method, starting off with 1, make an observation. And I would engage in a dialogue with the students about what they think goes on in each of these steps, the details of what they would do as researchers performing each of these steps. So for example, in the first step, make an observation, I would ask the students, what do you notice and why is it important? How do you make observations? By using your senses. And also in this step, you want to do lots of research about what you're observing before you can move on to step 2, which is ask a question. Now I would go through all of these steps, and as you can see underneath each step, I've highlighted a few questions that the researcher should consider when they're performing this step, as well as what the students should be writing about in their papers on the scientific method. So as I'm presenting this, I would be asking students what step they think comes next, why they think this step needs to come before the next step, and questions like that. A few things that I wanted to point out was that I also include some key vocabulary that the students should be focusing on. So for example, in step 3, form a hypothesis, I'm going to be reviewing that vocabulary word. Hypothesis is likely a new vocabulary word for the students, so making sure that they know the definition of this word as an educated guess is very important, and just highlighting the vocabulary within the method as well. Going through how a hypothesis should be formatted, and I'd give them a review of how it should be formatted as the if-then statement. And again, just continually going through some of the questions that they should be asking themselves as they're writing this paper. So for form a hypothesis, does it explain the relationship you're seeking to find? What is a hypothesis? These are all questions that should be guiding them as they're writing their papers. A common error that I was finding in the papers was that the students would only have one sentence about one of the steps of the method, and that's not sufficient. They need a lot more detail. And so in order to help them do this, they can answer some of these questions that I have bulleted under each of the steps. So I would continue going through this review. For example, design and perform an experiment. Does it test your hypothesis? How will you perform the experiment? And I'll have them consider things such as safety and protocols and things like that, just so that they can be adding as much detail as possible in their papers. By practicing their revision skills on these papers, they're also practicing how to add supporting details in their paragraphs, and they need support while they're doing this. So by going through each of the steps and what they could include, it's helping them brainstorm ideas. Also, in step 4, design and perform an experiment, I would highlight the dependent, independent, and control variables. These are also vocabulary words from the unit that are new to the students. And just, again, review those vocabulary words and emphasize to them that in this step, design and perform an experiment, they should be including what is a dependent, independent, and control variable, and why is it important to include that in this step. Continuing on, step 5 is in interpreting the results. I would go through, how would you analyze the data? Would you organize it into tables or graphs so that you can condense that information so that you can interpret it better? These are all supporting details that you could add into your essay. And lastly, the last step is to draw conclusions. Do your results make sense? What could have gone wrong? Would you repeat the experiment? How? Is your hypothesis correct? And I really want to highlight this here. Is your hypothesis correct? I would spend several minutes talking to the students about this because it's really important to emphasize that there is no right or wrong outcome in an experiment. One of the things that you'll find as I'm going through the sample paper is that this is a very common misconception. So emphasizing that during the review, and I'll also be emphasizing it again during my modeling of the sample, is very important because we want to make sure students understand this. Would you share your findings to communicate to the rest of the scientific community, and how would you do this? And if you were to make a new hypothesis, what would it be? This is also where you would propose a new experiment and would explain why you were proposing that experiment. And so these are all details that the student could write in their papers about what is going on during each of these steps. What does a researcher do? And again, by having students write these papers, they have to have a really firm understanding of the steps and what you're doing. And so hopefully, once they have this solid foundation in how to execute the steps of the scientific method, they'll actually be able to apply it to an experiment, and they'll be able to perform these questions in a specific scenario. So next, I would go through the actual paper organization that they should have. Now, the scientific method, there's a lot of steps to it. We just gave the students a lot of information here. And that being said, I would give the students a reference sheet very similar to this, just probably typed up, so that they could use this and have it with them by their side as they're doing the cut and grow activity. But I would also write it up on the board as we're going through it. Next on the board, I would write how they're actually going to organize all of this information. So first, I would explain that they should have an introductory paragraph between 4 and 5 sentences long. Why is the scientific method important? What would happen if we skipped a step? They could give an example here. How is it necessary to perform a successful experiment? Those are to give them a few ideas on what they could be writing about in that introductory paragraph. Next, they should have a separate paragraph for each step of the scientific method, at least 2 to 3 sentences each. And that makes sure that, they're giving at least 2 supporting details for what is included in each of these steps. Now, if they're stuck, I'll remind them that they have this handy-dandy reference sheet that they can use and refer to for supporting details. Let's say they get stuck on interpreting results and they only have 1 sentence and they need more. They can refer back to their reference sheet for interpreting results and get some more ideas about different things that are included in that step and what they could write about. Lastly, I would explain that they need a closing paragraph, also between 2 and 3 sentences long, answering the questions, how can following these steps help you as a scientist? Why is it helpful that all experiments follow these steps? And so I would also give them a reference sheet of this paper organization to have. So before I even model the cut and grow activity and send them off to do that, I'll be going through the paper organization and the steps of the scientific method on the board, and then they're going to have both of these reference sheets by their side to help them in writing their papers. So next, I'm going to do the actual modeling for the students of the sample essay. I'll explain to the students that this is not one of the students from the class. This is a sample from several years ago, and I'm just using it as an example to teach you a strategy called cut and grow, which is used to help us revise our papers. So the first step that I'm going to instruct students to do is to go through and read their essays for sentences that don't seem to make that much sense. So you're going to read the sentences out loud to yourself, and you're going to ask yourself, do these make sense? And I'll give them example. The very first sentence here, to do an investigation is necessary. Make the steps of the method scientific. It are the following. Now, when I read that out loud, I'm realizing that it's not really making much sense. So, no big deal. We're just going to highlight that sentence. So highlighting the sentence reminds us that we need to go back to that sentence and rephrase it in our cut and grow. So you're going to go through the entire writing sample, reading it out loud and highlighting sentences that don't make much sense. I'm going to also highlight this sentence right here because it's a run-on sentence. It's very long. It doesn't make much sense when put together. Now, students are going to do this part on their own. After you model this part, you're going to give them 1 or 2 minutes to read their own papers and highlight sentences that don't make much sense. Now, this is probably the first of many revisions that are going to be happening on this one piece of writing that they're doing. So as long as they highlight at least one sentence, hopefully more than one sentence, that they think doesn't really make much sense that they can improve upon, that's okay, because they're probably going to revise it again. So the next step that you're going to instruct the students to do is to make sure that they capitalize the first letter of each of their sentences. So they did a good job here, even though it's phrased incorrectly. But here we see that they should have capitalized this letter. And you're going to go through with them and read this sample and circle all of the sentences that they forgot to capitalize. And then you're going to give them a few minutes to go through their own pieces of writing and fix that same mistake. Next, you're going to explain that each new paragraph should be indented. This sample doesn't have any of the paragraphs indented. So we're going to go through and explain to the students that they should put an arrow next to each new paragraph. Next, you're going to explain to the students that they should have a new paragraph for each step of the method. So this doesn't have a step in it, but it's an introductory paragraph. So we're going to circle that because that should be on its own. This student did a good job separating that from the rest of the paper. Next, they have the first step is the observation. So this whole paragraph is on the observation. So we're going to circle that. But, oops, then I realized that the second step is the analysis of the information collected in the last step. So this actually they had as a new paragraph. So I'm going to circle that. And so this is a good learning moment. I just circled the wrong thing, but it's okay. I'm just going to fix it. So now I have 1, 2, 3 circles here. Next, they have the third step here. Sorry, I'm trying to do this with one hand. It's kind of difficult. Then they have the fourth step and the fifth step. And so you're going to instruct students to circle on their own each new paragraph. So they shouldn't have any circles that are describing more than one step. Next, the steps should be in order. Now, at this point, you're going to have the students reference back to the steps of the scientific method paper that we went through and have them make sure that the order that they listed in their essay is the same as the order that we went through in class.